delighted to introduce to you all Professor Dora Biro, who joined us in 2013, and she's a zoologist, and that's, I have to say, an understatement. She's currently Associate Professor of Animal Behaviour and Tutorial Fellow here in Biological Sciences. Dora has carried out a huge amount of research over many years in Europe, and we're thrilled to have her here in Oxford as part of the zoology team. And she's going to talk tonight about her research, the overarching aim of which is to gain insight into the general principles of underlying group living in animals. So I'm hoping to get some insights about being principal of a college at the University of Oxford, because some of the principles seem to have direct application. In particular, concerned about the mechanisms and consequences of social living and social organisation, and how individuals with conflicting knowledge or preferences resolve their differences. And that sounds very much like governing body. As well as what information is exchanged between group members during socially mediated learning. These are fundamental questions of group living, and she also continues to undertake research on the role of vision in alien navigation. A subject recently caught the attention of Sir David Attenborough, no less, who made a visit to come and see Dora here. So significant is her work just very recently, and we're all very excited about that. Dora's going to talk about living together.
Oh, thank you very much, Principal. Thank you for that nice introduction. So I'm going to start with an experiment, and it's an experiment that replicates one that Jens Krause, who's a German mathematical biologist, and his colleagues gave to some visitors at a science fair in Germany some years ago. And what I'm hoping it will do is to illustrate nicely one of the points that I'm hoping to make about the kind of hows and whys of living in groups as per my title. Okay, so the experiment itself is in two parts, and the first one requires a prop, which I have here, and I'm going to ask you a question about it, which is a very simple question. I'd like you to estimate how many beans you think there are in this jar. And I think the easiest is probably if we pass it around. Maybe we can start here. So I'd like you to each just have a look at that jar and try and make a sort of mental note of how many beans you think there are in there. And actually, so what I'd like is for these guesses to be independent. So try not to discuss with the people sitting next to you. Okay, and then we'll check the answers about halfway through the talk. So just make a mental note. Okay. Then part two of the experiment is a different question. So here, I would like you to guess, or even work out mathematically if you can, how many times you think you'd need to flip a coin for the probability that it always lands on heads to be the same as the probability of winning the German lotto. And if you're not familiar with the German lotto, the chances of winning it are 1 in 14 million. So the question is, how many times do you need to flip the coin for the probability that it will always land on heads? To be 1 in 14 million.
Is Thomas Anders excluded from this?
Yes, and actually so are my two biology finalists, because they've seen this in an undergrad lecture, but everyone else can play. Actually, no, Tom needs to play, in fact, but we'll come back to this again halfway through the talk. Okay, so I'm sorry I'm making you sort of multitask really early on, but don't spend too long on it. Okay, so I think many of you, or maybe all of you, have probably guessed what this is about. And so the idea is that here we are having come together as a group, and as such, we've actually got a really remarkable pool of knowledge that's available to us to draw on. And this is something that was recognized very early on by the famous statistician Francis Galton, who's a cousin of Charles Darwin, incidentally, when he conducted this rather famous study at the beginning of the 20th century. So what happened was Galton went to a country fair where they had a sort of, a guess the weight of the ox competition. So basically, these fairgoers could submit guesses on how much they thought an ox on display weighed. And then at the end, whoever guessed the closest won some sort of prize. And so what Galton did was he collected, at the end of the fair, he collected all the different guesses, and then he analyzed them statistically. And I think he had something like 800 different guesses to analyze. And Galton himself was quite a believer in the inherent value of expertise. So actually what he was hoping to show was that, just how dumb the average member of the public is. But what he actually found surprised him, because the actual weight of the ox was, should I turn the light down a little bit, or can you see? It's fine? Okay. So the actual weight of the ox was 1,198 pounds, but the median of the crowd's guesses was 1,207 pounds. So it was less than 1% away from the actual weight, from the true weight of the ox. So it seemed like collectively this group of fairgoers was able to make a highly accurate judgment. In a way, collectively they knew the weight of the ox, even though no single individual had got it right by themselves. And we see this sort of thing all around us. So if you look, for example, at how contestants on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire fare when they ask for help, then if they phone a friend, which you may recall is sort of based on the contestant's belief that they're asking someone who's a supposed expert on a particular theme, these experts are correct in 65% of cases. But if they ask the audience, where, again, if you remember, it's based on every member of the audience voting which one they think the right answer is. So if they ask the audience, then they get a correct answer 91% of the time. And again, remember, these are supposedly average members of the public, not necessarily experts on that particular question. So the point is that crowds are actually wise, even when they don't know that they are. And they can solve problems that even experts might find hard in some cases. And then we can actually look for these sorts of effects in non-humans as well. So here's a nice experiment that looks at whether ants, as colonies rather than as individual ants, can solve specific optimization problems. So the task here was to navigate, this is a task given to ants, and the task here was to navigate through this maze from A to B, where A is where the nest of this particular group of ants was, and B had some food at it. So basically they had to get from A to B. And if you're an ant, it pays to expend as little energy on transporting food back and forth as possible. So basically they would it would pay you to find the shortest route through this maze. And it seemed to be the case that ant colonies indeed were able to optimize here. They could get through the maze via the shortest possible route. You can see the column of ants sort of walking along the outer edge of the maze, which actually represents the shortest route here. And they do this by a sort of gradual process where if they find a good route, it gets a kind of positive feedback because ants lay pheromones as they go along. And then bad routes, which would include sort of detours around the maze, get gradually discontinued. They get gradually abandoned. And even slime mold can solve complex optimization problems through it's quite a similar mechanism. So here we have a slime mold that starts out from the middle of this plate, and you've got these are bits of food that are distributed around the arena, so to speak. And what the slime mold's task here is to connect, to build a transport network among these different food sources. So what slime molds do is they initially sort of expand along this kind of contiguous foraging margin, but when they find food, they produce these little tubules that then connect the food sources to each other and then to home in a way. And so the whole thing basically represents a transport network. So as you can see, by the end, they managed to connect all the dots, essentially. So then, the question is, how good is this solution? How optimal is it? And the trick here was that in this experiment, the food patches were actually laid out in a pattern that replicated the distribution of large cities in the Tokyo metropolitan area. And the transport network that the slime mold built could be compared in its efficiency to the railway network that the Tokyo Transport Authority had constructed. And amazingly, the two networks really resemble each other in many ways, not just in the sort of overall layout, but also in terms of efficiency. So for example, how long you have to travel to get from one specific point to another, and also in terms of resilience. So how robust they are to, if you knock particular bits of the network out. Okay. And so the way these sorts of things are thought to work, and the way that animal, including human collectives, are able to be more than the sum of their parts, is being examined in a fairly new discipline in behavioral biology, something that's inspired in large part actually by statistical physics, called collective behaviour. And the idea is that in these systems we've got lots of interacting units, individual animals in our case, each of whom relies on relatively simple local rules of interaction with their neighbours. But through these kinds of interactions, something emerges, something quite complex can emerge that's actually hard to predict just from the behaviour of single individuals. And so a termite mound like this is I think, a really perfect example. So here each termite goes about its business, it interacts with a few other termites, building nearby, but none of them really have any kind of global overview of what structure it is that they're building, what the final mound looks like. There's no blueprint of what they're trying to build, and simply the structure emerges out of their interactions with each other and with the environment. And of course that's a very different situation to something like this, where there is a single Gaudi who designs the overall structure, and then you've got construction bosses who tell their workers what to do, and they're looking at blueprints and so on. So there's none of that in the termite mound, and yet you end up with this incredibly exquisite structure at the end of it. And then, so there's lots of other spectacular examples of complex structures emerging out of simple interactions between individuals. And so starling flocks, murmurations are a great case in point. So these are tens of thousands of individuals that produce these really incredible aerial formations. But we now understand that actually there's nothing, there's no sort of overall guidance that gives the flocks their shape. Each individual follows a set of relatively simple rules. For example, don't collide with your neighbors, and then adopt or align yourself with the average heading of all your neighbors, and so on. And the overall structure then emerges from these, tens of thousands of interactions between the constituent members of these flocks. So that, like with the termite nest, really, there's no kind of overall voice that directs these flocks. And we have a similar story here. These are schooling fish. Can you see? Yeah, you can see. And again, each individual is simply responding to its neighbors, and yet as a group, they appear incredibly well coordinated, particularly because their responses to their neighbors are executed on really, really short timescales. And then I've got an example for humans, from humans, which is quite topical this week. So the Mexican wave. Here we also have thousands of individuals, and together they produce this, gently undulating motion. And I think we have a sort of intuitive understanding of how this works, but people have done simulations of this, for example, where you can show that the wave can actually start and propagate without any kind of overall direction. I can take that. Thank you. Yeah, so the wave can propagate without any kind of overall direction. People simply respond to what those sitting next to them are doing. If they see them stand up, they stand up as well, and then they sit down with some sort of given delay. And that alone is able to generate this wave. Okay, so at this point, I just want to take a step back from what groups are capable of, and just first of all look at why animals live in groups in the first place. And then there are of course many sound evolutionary, or what we call adaptive reasons for why an individual might choose to live in a group. As a group you can build bigger things, you can spot danger better, you've got more eyes, you can dilute your own individual risk. If a predator catches someone, it might well not be you. You can huddle together and save energy. You can raise young together cooperatively. you can hunt larger prey, and also you can rely on the knowledge of those that know a little bit more than you about the environment. So there's lots of reasons that evolutionary biologists discuss for why group living exists in the first place. But so one of the important things from my own researcher's point of view is that in these groups, not everyone is equal. It's quite a trivial statement, I know, but we have to remember that some individuals will know different things, they can have different opinions, they might want different things, and so on. And then this idea that members of animal groups aren't equal is then a kind of key premise to some of the work that I've been doing. So first of all, we've got the problem of group decision making. How can we reconcile different opinions in a group and reach joint decisions that affect us all if we're trying to keep our group together at the same time? On the other hand, aside from this kind of diversity within groups posing a challenge, in fact there are the fact that there are these differences in experience and knowledge also present an opportunity that for less experienced group members to learn, to obtain information from more experienced ones. So basically for both of these scenarios, what I want to do is to try and show you a few things that I and my students and my collaborators have been doing, trying to understand how animals deal with these sorts of challenges and opportunities of living in groups. So let me start with the first of these and look at how individuals reconcile conflict and make group decisions in the context of collective travel. Okay, so one of the things that my group's currently doing is using homing pigeons as a model species for understanding how groups reconcile conflict over opinions. And what we do is we fit individual pigeons with these miniature GPS devices, which they carry in a little backpack on their back, and then we can release them individually or as flocks from various release locations set in various distances and directions from their home loft, basically to get them to solve navigational tasks either together or individually. And then from these GPS data, we can then reconstruct with really exquisite precision the movement of every individual within every individual flock member, and then work out how they're sort of interacting with each other during flight, how they are solving navigational problems together, and so on. All of that on timescales of 1/10 of a second. This is not a real. I mean, so this is not a video. What I'm trying to say is this is a visualization, a computer visualization based on these GPS data. But you can agree it sort of looks quite realistic. Yeah, I do. I know. This always gets a laugh, and I could never work out why it got a laugh. And then I think somebody told me it's the purple one that so everyone feels sorry for.
Realistic representation that one bird is.
Yeah. That's what it was doing at the time. So yeah, it was getting left behind. Well, or it had its own idea. Well, we'll come to that actually. Okay. So I want to show you first of all what individual birds' homing tracks look like. So these are 4 different birds, and each of them is flying 4 times individually, so alone, from a release site, so up here, back to the home loft in the Oxford University Field Station in Whiten Village, so sort of northeast of here. So each of them is doing that journey 4 different times. And you can see that there's quite a lot of variability, both within individuals and between individuals. And there's a lot of very indirect routes home. So they don't fly as the crow flies. So these are the first 4 times that any of these birds had ever done this journey. And so now I want to show you what happens if you keep releasing these birds from that site over and over again. So next in red, I'm going to show you what these routes look like after the birds have done this 20 times. And they're very striking. So you can see that each bird basically settles on a route that it seems to favor, it seems to prefer, and it recapitulates it quite faithfully on every single release from then onwards. So they really have these routes that they like to stick to, and that's just, every time they release them, that's just what they'll do. Again, they're not completely straight, and also very importantly, they're different between different individuals, right? So some are more similar than others, but each of them is individually distinct. So you could perhaps think of them as individual birds' opinions about what the route is that they should take. And then we can run an experiment, a kind of collective decision-making scenario with just one obvious manipulation, which is to release pairs of birds together. So we can effectively create various levels of conflict between individuals by giving birds the task of solving this problem together. In these animations, I'll show you what the sorts of things that can happen when you release two birds together, each with its own preferred route, and these routes will be different between them. So essentially, they're trying to get to the same destination, but they have different ideas about how to get there. And so in each of the animations, the red and the blue tracks are the solo preferred routes of those two birds. So that's what each of them would want to do were it flying on its own. And then in yellow, I'll show you what they did when they were made to fly as a pair. So I think in the first animation, we've got a case of what we might call leadership. So here, the pair clearly follows the route of the red bird all the way home. Then in the second animation, we've also got leadership, but the leadership alternates. So they start out on the red bird's route, and then just as the two routes cross over, the red bird takes over, and then that's the one that's leading the remainder of the way. Then we've got a nice example of a sort of compromise. So they start out on the bluebird's route, but fairly quickly they basically take almost an exact intermediate between their two preferred routes. So they're sort of averaging their opinions. They've reached a compromise almost exactly halfway between their two opinions. And then we've got a case of failing to resolve conflict. So here they start out averaging, and then just as the two routes really begin to diverge, I think there's a sort of divorce of sorts. So basically what this shows is that you can actually get quite a range of different outcomes of this conflict resolution process. But it turns out that we can actually explain how we can get this range of outcomes by building quite a simple mathematical model in which birds follow just two simple rules. One, you want to stick with your partner, and two, you want to stick with your own opinion. Effectively, you want to stay on your route as much as you can. And what that model then shows is that with just these two simple rules, you can get all the different outcomes that I showed you, all the different outcomes that we observed, but they depend, which one you get depends on the level of conflict that exists between the birds. So in short, when conflict is small, so when the difference between the two birds' opinions is small, they end up compromising over the route and they go down the middle. But when the conflict is large, then either they pick a leader or they split up. And actually that sort of makes sense if you think about it, because it really only makes sense to compromise when, in cases where the average is going to be fairly close to what either of you wants to do. Whereas, when you've got really different ideas, then an average is not going to make either of you very happy. Right. Okay. And then the final point I want to make here is that we can show that, in the end, we can show that conflict, it is the conflict itself, the diversity among individuals itself that can lead to better solutions to problems. Because, so for example, we find that flocks of birds are able to find more direct routes home than individuals. And the mechanism for this is quite intuitive. So imagine you're starting out here and you're trying to reach a destination up there. And we're trying to get there together, but none of us really knows the exact direction, which would be that one. So if you have one individual trying to solve this, they might get it wrong, and so will another individual, and another, and so on, and so on, and so on, and until you can add more and more individuals, and the more you add, you see that as you then collate all of these ideas and take an average, it can actually give you a very accurate estimate of the true direction. And in fact, this estimate can be better than any of the individual estimates on their own. So effectively, the group outperforms even the best guesser here. And that, of course, is the mechanism for the wisdom of the crowd effect that we talked about at the beginning, or wisdom of the flock in this case. Does that clear? Make sense? Okay. Okay, so I want to come back to to our experiment then. And if we do have time, yeah. So I'd like you to shout out your guesses let's start with question 1. So if anyone would like to start with the jar guesses, and then we don't all need to do it, but
300.
Okay.
300.
301.
280. 280.
300. It's a lot of 300.
157.
150. 157.
480.
420.
450.
450.
380.
140.
380. 140. Okay.
550.
550. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's. You hate Excel. I'm very sorry. Okay. So we've got. Okay. So we've got one person who actually got it right, which I think is quite amazing. And we are very, very close to the true number, which was 301.
Big difference.
Who's going to win this? I have a suspicion. Okay. So then question 2. Not Tom first, Tom.
24.
24.
Yeah, 24.
25.
32. 32.
32.
25.
17.
203.
Two to the power of x equals 14 million. Therefore,
20 plus 14.
24. 24.
Okay. All right, I think we can stop there. Yes, the answer is 24. I am incredibly impressed, actually, because this is so much better than what the original experiment itself found. Because
So in the original experiment, what they found was that people did pretty well as a group on the bean guessing game. There were some far out guesses, but they sort of cancelled each other out, and on average, the group got very close to the correct number. But with the second question, a lot of people were wildly off, and that's probably because they were thrown by this 1 in 14 million, huge number. It must be a huge number then that we should be guessing, and so they were guessing much, much higher values than 24, and that really threw the group's average. Whereas they suspected there were some experts in among the visitors there, and they definitely outperformed the group as a whole. So the scenarios are quite different, because in the first one, experts don't perform better than the group, whereas in the second one, experts perform better. So, I guess the point is there are some situations in which mathematicians are particularly useful, and they should be listened to, I think. Okay, right. Okay, so now, so the wisdom of the crowd effect suggests that diversity and expertise have their benefits for how well a group performs as a whole at a certain task. But there's another way in which diversity can be a good thing, and I also alluded to this at the beginning. It can allow less experienced group members to acquire information from those more experienced. And for biologists, when this kind of learning, which we call social learning, occurs locally within groups and also across generations, it can produce divergence among different populations in behavior. And that's what we biologists refer to as culture. And I do realize that when we say culture colloquially, we tend to think of these sorts of things. So we tend to think of the sort of grand sum of human knowledge and achievement. We think of art and literature and science and music and so on. And yes, it's true, we don't quite see these sorts of things among animals, non-human animals. But as a biologist, it's actually very reasonable to ask where all of this comes from. Are we really alone as a species in possessing these sorts of capacities, or do we see the evolutionary roots of culture in other species? And the answer is, of course, that these sorts of questions are evolutionarily meaningful. So the discussion of culture in animals really begins here in the 1950s. So this is Koshima Island in Japan, a country where primatology as a discipline actually originates. So Japan is the only first world country that has indigenous primate species, and it has probably as a result really been a sort of pioneer in the world, particularly in terms of behavioral studies of primates. So on Koshima, to make the primates easier to observe, these early primatologists started providing them with sweet potatoes, which would sort of lure them down to the beaches so they'd be easier to observe. And then these potatoes landed on the sandy beaches, and sand is not particularly nice to eat. So what the researchers observed one day was that a particular female named Emo took this sweet potato to the sea and washed the sand off it, and then ate it. And then soon after, Emo's kid was seen to do the same thing. And then soon after that, Emo's kids' playmates were seen to do this, and so on, and the behavior spread until all of the monkeys in this population went to wash their sweet potatoes in the sea. And importantly, this was a behavior that wasn't seen anywhere else in Japan. It was only seen in this one particular troop. So it could be taken to be a sort of cultural behavior, or cultural difference between different monkey groups, much like how we would eat sweet potatoes with forks here, whereas a Japanese researcher would eat them with chopsticks. So when it came to writing up these observations, the behavior was reported for the first time, the word was used, as a pre-cultural behavior, when using the prefix pre as a sort of concession to the prevailing view at the time that human culture really was in a class of its own. But soon after, lots of other reports followed, first from other primates, then from many other species, from dolphins, from whales, from songbirds, from meerkats, and so on. Each of them kind of documenting regional variations in behavior across different populations of the same species. And it is currently probably one of the hottest topics in behavioral biology. So a general definition of what a biologist would understand culture to be goes something like this. So we are looking for behaviors that are transmitted by animals learning from each other, so learning socially, rather than through genetic means. Then the behaviors should be shared by many members of a group, and they should vary between groups, or often do vary between groups. That's quite an important point. And they should show some degree of permanence over time. And so the study that sort of probably best exemplifies the approach of looking for differences in behavior between different populations of the same species begins with this paper from 1999 by Andy Whiten and some colleagues. And this is one of the figures from that paper, which is it has become an absolutely iconic image that's basically burnt onto the retina of every cultural primatologist. But the basic idea is that Whiten and his colleagues collated data over many, many decades of field observations of chimpanzees from 6 of the longest running field research sites in Africa. And they identified 39 behavioral variants, which they deemed to be potentially cultural, in the sense that they appeared in some populations, but they didn't appear in other populations, and there didn't seem to be an obvious reason why there were these differences. So these are all the different behaviors represented in the matrix, and so when one of the cells has a drawing in it, it means that that behavior is present in that population, and when it's empty, it means that it's not present there. And you can see that, I mean, the main message of this figure is basically that each of these 6 sites has a completely unique, a totally unique constellation of behaviors that that individuals within that population perform. So if you like, you can call that their, sort of cultural profile. And, essentially what that means is if you show me a chimpanzee and if you show me what sorts of behaviors it performs, then I can tell you where it comes from. Okay, so the site where I've been doing some of my field work is this one here, Bossou, in Guinea. That's what that looks like. So this is it in collaboration with some Japanese primatologists from Kyoto University. And we see that these guys are ones that perform, that are the only ones that perform some of these so-called or perverted cultural behaviors. So for example, this one seems to be unique to just this population of chimpanzees. It's called pestle pounding. And what they do is, sorry, probably don't need all the sound. So what they do is they break off a palm frond from the top of a palm tree, which they then use basically as a kind of pestle to pound the top of the palm tree to liquefy the pith that's inside, which they can then extract and eat by their hands. So chimpanzees, nowhere else in Africa do chimpanzees do this. It's only this one particular site where that's been seen. Okay. And then this behavior, this is called ant dipping. So these are army ants, which live on the forest floor, and they're quite vicious things, but apparently they're also quite tasty. So they're a good source of nutrients. So what Tim said Bossou do, I need to fast forward, sorry. What they do is they take a stick, They take a stick which they then sort of dip into a line of marching army ants. The ants climb up it, and then you can quickly gather the stick, take the stick to your mouth, and eat the ants. Sorry, I saw some of their faces, and I think people aren't impressed. But they love this, so clearly it's a good thing. But again, not all chimpanzees across Africa do this behavior. And then another one, which is NutCracking, and this is the behavior that I've been studying, that I myself have been studying mostly out of all the different cultural behaviors. And what they do here is they take a pair of stones, which they use as hammer and anvil, to crack open hard-shelled nuts. And in the case of this particular community, the Bossou community, it's the oil palm nut that they crack. So they've got plenty of oil palm. And it's got a very nutritious kernel, so obviously it's worth the effort. But it's quite it's quite a delicate operation. You've got to pick the right stones. They've got to be the right shapes, the right sizes, and then you've got to work out exactly how much force you need to hit the nut with, and so on. And the very skilled individuals just need a single hit of the hammer to crack those nuts without really shattering them. Okay. So, just to explain a little bit more why these are considered cultural behaviors. So here's a map of some of the chimpanzee sites, some more chimpanzee sites that have been explored since that original paper. And it seems that there's a clear kind of regional clumping in terms of which chimpanzees perform NutCracking. So this is just about NutCracking, which are the ones in yellow and which ones don't. So all the ones, or most of the ones in West Africa seem to do it, and none of the ones in East Africa do it. And that's despite the fact that both nuts and stones are available to East African chimpanzees as well. So it's not like they could do it if, in theory, they could do it. So the story goes, the story might be that a chimpanzee in West Africa, or perhaps several chimpanzees in West Africa, invented this behavior, and then it spread locally, first within their group, and then through kind of local migrations, they took that knowledge with them to neighboring groups as well, but it simply hasn't made it as far as East Africa yet. Potentially because there's some quite significant geographical barriers, a massive river here that might limit migrations. But then even in the groups, in the communities that do crack nuts, there are some quite subtle differences in the ways that they do that. So for example, at our site in Guinea, they always use a pair of movable stones as hammer and anvil. Also, they always use just one hand to hold the hammer with, and they always crack a single species of nut, which is the oil palm. But in another well-studied community, which is in the Thai forest in the Ivory Coast, they sometimes use wooden hammers, sometimes wooden anvils, sometimes they hold the hammer bimanually, so with both hands, and they also crack other species of nuts, not just the oil palm. And so I think the fact that there are these subtle differences and that they're consistent and that they persist really reinforces that the idea that this is all, that they're part of culture, basically. So what group you're born into effectively influences exactly how you're going to do things. And then we also know that learning to crack nuts is hard work. So in fact, it's a skill that takes years to master. So young chimpanzees first begin to manipulate the relevant objects when they're about a year old. So they'll start to roll stones and they'll roll nuts and so on. And first they just manipulate a single object at a time. Then they try combining two objects, then eventually three objects. But even then, not necessarily in the right order. So for example, they might put a rock on top of another rock and then the nut on top, and then they hit. So they get it wrong for a long, long time. And in fact, they're only successful. The first successful NutCracking episode happens around 3.5 to 4 years of age. So for about 2.5 or 3 years, they're trying, and they're not getting it. Okay. So. Interestingly also, if they don't learn by the age of about 6 or 7 years, they never learn. So there seems to be a kind of sensitive period as well for learning. But so the question is, why do they keep practicing for years if they're not getting any kind of direct rewards? And I think one of the things that's become really clear to us is that it's the social environment that's really channeling their interest. Because nutcracking is a really very social activity. So when these are, scenes where young really have the opportunity to closely observe adults around them cracking nuts. Sometimes they can even steal freshly cracked kernels from the adults. Sometimes they can even steal their stones as well, so they can learn, they can learn there's something tasty inside the kernel, and they can learn about the properties of, what makes a good tool by basically inheriting them from or stealing them from adults. And I just want to show you one last video, and it's a really nice clip of just how interested young chimps are in what adults are doing. So this is an adult female who's about to start cracking nuts, and these are two juveniles who are going to be really fascinated by what she's doing. And here we've provided some nuts that aren't familiar to these chimpanzees. So these are a different species that's available in a nearby forest, but not in this particular forest. And so it's kind of hard not to anthropomorphize about something like this. But what we think is basically happening here is that because these are nuts, these here are nuts that none of these chimps have ever cracked before, the young are particularly interested. And now that they've seen an adult do it, they're going to try and do it for themselves. And in fact, what's interesting is that this adult female, we suspect, is actually an immigrant. We suspect that she's arrived from a nearby community where these nuts do exist and are cracked by members of that community. And she's kind of brought that knowledge with her, which is now going to spread and become part of the culture of this new community that has received her. Okay. And then this is really my final point, as the thing that may actually truly be unique about human culture. So this idea is a cumulative culture is the capacity of accumulating increasingly better solutions, better designs to problems. Sorry, better designs or better solutions to problems over time, for example, in technology. And the analogy goes that there's a ratchet that's gradually being turned, where innovations build on previous innovations until we end up with things that no single individual could invent on their own in a single lifetime. So if you think about something like the moon rover, right? So clearly this is something that only thousands or even millions of years of technological knowledge accumulation could have produced. None of us could, you know, build one of these from first principles. But could we perhaps see glimpses of this sort of thing in chimpanzees as well? So one interesting thing that we've seen chimpanzees at Bossou do is that when they end up with an anvil that doesn't have a nice sort of horizontal surface but is a bit slanted, where if you put a nut on top it's just going to keep rolling down, is that they sometimes insert a third stone, which we can call a wedge, underneath it to kind of raise it and level the surface. And well, we think this is actually pretty smart, and for now it's actually quite rare, but the idea is that this is an innovation that builds upon the group's previous knowledge or existing knowledge on how to crack nuts. So for example, you could argue that perhaps whichever chimpanzee invented wedges couldn't have invented it if it hadn't grown up in a community that already knew how to crack nuts or had it as its sort of routine, a routine part of its behavior. So I think the moon rover is probably quite a long way off still, but having the capacity for innovations like this, for building on the knowledge that our ancestors gathered, is probably how we started out as well. And I think that's it. So just remains to thank. So these are various collaborators who are involved in some of the research that I've discussed and some funders. And that's it. So thank you very much.